facilitate them to be able to do business.
But how will they do that? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, the one piece of legislation most people tend to refer to in this sort of conversation, what was known as the Donde Bill, but now is already part of law.
Yes.
The most famous bit of that is the Induclim rule, but there's also something else mandating rates to be plus, what, 3 or 4% of T-bill rate, I believe?
The Donde Acts, as it was known, basically the Central Bank of Kenya Amendment Act 2000, capped interest rates for a whole 55 months, from January 2001 to July 31st, July 2005, at Treasury bill rate plus 4, as the maximum banks in this country would charge on all their lending. That was largely ignored, and not a single bank applied that rate of interest. It was later repealed. I mentioned the date of July 2005, because that was the effective date of the repeal. But for those 55 months, there was compulsory interest rate control in this country, which I said was ignored. So that is history. But moving forward, in that Donde Bill was the Monetary Policy Committee, which again was to assist in advising on what the Treasury bill rate should be. That committee is still retained in the current laws. They repealed everything else except that particular committee. The committee is in place. And it's coming up with some recommendation on what the rates should be, what direction they should take. But as I said, it's largely ignored. So like the Donde Act was ignored for 55 months, we are seeing again where central bank is giving guidelines or giving recommendations which are largely ignored.
But it's not assertive. It's
not assertive. I think if we agree that we're going to achieve this Vision 2030 in terms of job creation, I think we must engage our youth, our people, our women, and giving them access to credit.
Clarify this for me. When you say assertive, what exactly would you like to see them do? Because I'm thinking of an example here from the energy sector, where the Energy Regulatory Commission tends to be very nasty to both KPLC and KenGen if they step out of line. They have to apply for a tariff increase, for example, if they want one. And the regulator has to approve it. But that sort of thing doesn't exist in the banking sector. So
I don't want to speculate why the central bank cannot behave in the same way like the other regulators in this country. I think they can, yes.
Andrea, regulators got no teeth?
No, I'm always a bit reluctant on regulation because, you know, you always have this balance. You try to find a balance between market forces and regulation is typically for consumer protection and for system stability reasons. And so if you move in that direction of saying we'll cap interest rates at, you know, Treasury bill rates plus whatever percentage point it is, then you need to enforce that, otherwise it's meaningless. So you spend a lot of money on enforcing it. And also what you've seen historically is that a lot of banks said, right, it takes me about the same effort to do a loan of 100,000 shillings as it would take me to do a loan of $1 million. So if there's a cap on the interest rate of what I can charge, I will just do the one loan at $1 million rather than do, you know, all these small loans.
So essentially would distort the
historically, what we found is that an interest rate regulation like that has actually been counterproductive to getting more loans out in the market. And so whilst I think there are lots of inefficiencies in the market, I'd be very, very reluctant to say we need to regulate interest rates. And it's also, when we talk about Vision 2030, there's so many factors that come into play here that I think it's very unfair and also unrealistic to burden the banks with say making this happen. So if you look at, for example, stable power supplies, lowering power prices, you know, improving security, and that's especially a case for banks because they deal with money and they have an obligation towards their clients' money. I mean, these security company, cash and transit, you know, the internet is alive with jokes about that, but you know, that costs money. And I think job creation cannot just be a function of cheap credit. If you don't have a business understanding, I can give you free money and you will not turn it into a business and an employment. So that's sort of, you know, back to front.
Okay, let's focus on specific issues. In your view, where are the system deficiencies, quote unquote, in transmitting that signal from the CBR, Monetary Policy Committee, moves it up, moves it down, but that signal somehow gets lost in transmission all the way to the banks.
Well, there's sort of a bit of a residual thing that, you know, petrol companies always go, when oil prices go up, they always jack up the prices. And then you go, but global oil prices have come down, and they sort of go, you know, we've completely forgotten about that. So I think there's obviously, you know, a profit motive, most definitely. But as I said, you know, the lack of creditor information, high operational costs, those are all things that come into the interest rate. And then also the central bank rate is a short-term interest rate, so that doesn't necessarily translate into the longer-term interest rates. And it's a structural issue, again, that there's a lack of availability of long-term financing instruments. So what you will effectively find is there are more I say people trying to get into that market niche where you've got a couple of funds that work with SMEs, for example, say, you know, you can't actually borrow at 18% and still survive. So we have an alternative mechanism for this. There's some talk, you know, bond issues slowly going up, just basically to match the maturity. So if you want to lend long term, you need to find your money long. You have to have that long-term commitment as well. So I'm not really a believer in saying, let's just sort of, you know, put a lock on the interest rates and then everything else will magically happen. I think the downsides of that kind of interfering regulation will probably be bigger than sort of having the slow, gradual movement towards lower interest rates, which I think will happen. And then also don't forget government borrowing. As long as government is so, I mean, hopefully this will will look better this year if you know, we've got enough rains, agriculture improves, tax revenues go up, so that sort of takes the pressure off. But as long as you can lend to government for, I think the last infrastructure bond's nearly 10%. You know, why would you give that to a small company where you have to do a huge due diligence, you know, you have much bigger risk, and you lend that cheaper? I mean, that makes absolutely no business sense, and I think any shareholder of a bank would say, don't do that with my, you know, with my assets. Don't do that.
Wilfred, is there a moral argument? Because the economic side of this is one thing, but is there a moral argument for banks to cut rates? Because on one hand, you can't really be taking money from me at 5% or so, and that's the bulk of what forms your asset base, or rather your liabilities, as it were. And then at the same time, you lend that back to me at 20%. Doesn't really make sense, does it?
I think there is a moral argument in the sense that most of the money they are lending, okay, they are supposed to make sure they look after it properly, is actually coming from depositors.
Yeah.
And if that spread thing is too high, then I feel that we are not really looking at the totality of the whole thing, in that we have an economy to develop, and you cannot be the only sector that is making huge profits when everybody else is struggling. And I'm talking about the SMEs that I'm really passionate about, in that they can really create the jobs.
Actually, they have been creating the jobs the last 5 years, haven't they?
If we can lend them at that 18-20%, then they struggle. In fact, the risk increases, because a little jolt in the economy, and most of those fellows will go out because they just can't afford the high interest rates. So it's a catch-22 situation where high interest rates because somebody is riskier, but chances are you are actually making him even more riskier, because if there is a little something going